Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tarek Jazil, and I'm a co-editor of Antipode, along with Nick Theodore, Catherine McKittrick, Marion Werner, and as of this year, Dave Featherstone and Kieran Asher as well. Our editorial manager, Andy Kent, who many of you will have corresponded with over the years, is also here with us today. And on behalf of all of us from the editorial collective, I'd like to welcome you to this year's Antipode lecture at the RGS-IBG conference here in Cardiff. Before we begin, I should inform you that the lecture and the question and answer session afterwards been filmed as part of the journal's lecture series, which also means, of course, that it will be posted in due course on the Foundation's website. And also, to remind you, I'm sure you haven't forgotten, but we're hosting a drinks reception after today's lecture from about 6:45, a bit earlier actually, 6:30 onwards, in the marquee outside the main building. So please do come and join us for some radical wine. So before introducing our speakers today, I just want to say a couple of thank yous actually. First to Wiley Blackwell for enabling the reception, and particularly our publishers, Wiley Blackwell, and particularly Catherine, Amanda, and Bea, who continue to work with us and support us at the Journal. I also want to thank the Antipode Foundation. The Journal, of course, is just one part of the Foundation's broader efforts to support research in radical and critical geography internationally. And it's important, I think, that they get the recognition they deserve for that. The Foundation also sponsors this lecture, as well as our annual lectures at the AAG conference and also at the Institute of Australian Geographers conference. So myself and the editorial collective are extremely grateful for the Foundation's ongoing efforts and support. And finally, as I do every year, I want to extend a massive thank you to all of you here who've reviewed for us over the last year. Next year will mark the journal's 50th birthday, actually, and we continue to depend on the intellectual generosity, the labour and collective excellence, quite frankly, of the intellectual community that you all represent. And I personally continue to be humbled by your willingness and efforts in this capacity. So thank you sincerely from us for all your efforts. So to our speaker today, it's a massive pleasure for me to be able to introduce Professor Derek Gregory, who's kindly agreed to give this year's Antipode lecture. Derek graduated from the University of Cambridge and was appointed to the faculty there at the age of 22, before moving to the University of British Columbia in 1989, where he's now the Peter Wall Distinguished Professor of Geography. Derek's early work focused on the historical geographies of industrialization and also, of course, on social theory and geography. His 1978 book, Ideology, Science and Human Geography, for example, was a hugely influential critique of the scientific method's positivist imprint on human geography. And his subsequent 1994 book, Geographical Imaginations, explored the relations between social theory, place, space, and landscape. And these books, together with a raft of influential articles and chapters that Derek wrote during this period, have, I think, been instrumental in pushing our discipline into its post-positivist incarnations. And in so doing, Derek's work, I think, has also been pivotal in showing us, as a discipline, the benefits of thinking and working with post-colonial and cultural theory. Not least, of course, with the spatial lexicon that Edward Said's work gives us. And I mention this here in this context because I think in the context of critical and radical geography's history, Derek's writings, for me, have persistently demonstrated the radical political value and potential of engaging critically with humanistic culture. Since the mid-1990s or so, Derek's research has focused on the ways that modern war has and has not changed in the 20th and 21st centuries. After 9/11, much of his work addressed military and paramilitary violence in the Middle East, notably through his landmark book, The Colonial Present. But more recently, his work has sought to map the trajectory of American military power from 1914 through to the present. And this work has involved two complementary studies. First, a detailed analysis of the changing nature of aerial violence from the First World War through the combined bomber offensives against Germany in the Second World War, the bombing of Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, to drone strikes more recently over Afghanistan, Pakistan, Yemen, and elsewhere. And second, an account of the embodied nature of modern war, centering on the evacuation of casualties, combatants, and civilians from war zones from 1914 through to the present, about which, of course, Derek's going to be speaking this afternoon. And these two projects have intersected in his analysis of attacks on hospitals, healthcare workers, and patients in war zones, and the implications of these kinds of attacks for both international law and the conduct of late modern warfare. These are studies that form part of two current book projects entitled Reach from the Sky, Aerial Violence and the Everywhere War, and secondly, The Purple Testament of War, Bodies and Woundscapes, about which, of course, we're extremely excited, it's fair to say. Derek's research regularly, routinely involves archival work and interviews, but he's also always keenly interested in the ways that imaginative literature and creative work can be incorporated into the research process. He was, for example, consulted in the early stages of Owen Shear's novel I Saw a Man, and Guy Hibbard's movie Eye in the Sky as well. And Derek's also developed a series of performance and creative works related with his research. And of course, many of us in this audience enjoy keeping abreast of Derek's thoughts, his ideas, and developing opinions via his blog, Geographical Imaginations, War, Space and Bodies, kind of an institution in and of itself, actually. In 2006, Derek was awarded the Founders Medal by the RGS for his contributions to social theory and human geography, and he holds honorary degrees from Heidelberg and Roskilde universities, as well as an honorary fellowship at King's College London. So we're thrilled that Derek accepted our invitation to give Antipode's annual lecture here at the conference this year. And as I said, it's a massive pleasure for me personally to be able to introduce him today. The title of his talk today is Trauma Geographies, Broken Bodies and Lethal Landscapes. So please do join me in welcoming Derek.
Where's the mic? Thank you very much indeed. It really is a tremendous pleasure to be here. I should confess to having my own trauma geography. I can normally cope with jet lag reasonably well, having encountered it so often, but it hits me most viciously between 4 o'clock and 6 o'clock. So please bear with me. What I want to talk about today is based on a series of genealogies and geographies which address what happens to wounded bodies in conflict zones. And I was drawn to this by a remark made by Elaine Scurry in The Body in Pain. She writes, "The main purpose and outcome of war is injuring. Though this fact is too self-evident and massive ever to be directly contested, it can disappear from view along many separate paths." What I want to do this afternoon is to bring some of those views, some of those paths back into the zone of intelligibility. But in doing so, I'm also inspired by the work of a good friend, Omar Douachi, and in particular, his extraordinary essay, When Wounds Travel. In that essay, he says that he asks, what is revealed in these wounds that travel, these wounds that enter new social worlds and multiple histories of violence? And it's that combination of history and geography, of genealogy and geography, that I want to work with today. And I'm going to do so by making 3 site visits. The first is to Belgium and France between 1914 and 1918. I now live in Canada, and every year on the 11th of November, this poem by Major John McCrae, In Flanders Fields, is read from coast to coast to coast. In Flanders fields the poppies grow, between the crosses, row on row. It's an extraordinary memorial to the death of his close friend and to the death of so many in war. But what often gets lost from view is that John McCrae was a medical officer. And he wrote that poem sitting on the tailboard of a truck at Essex Farm Advanced Dressing Station in Flanders. So behind that poem, behind that dressing station, were ragged columns of broken bodies moving across the landscape. And the mechanical nature of the production of those maimed bodies is captured, I think, in this remark by Captain Radcliffe Dugmore. The well men were rapidly moving eastward in countless numbers, going forward to the assistance of their comrades, while the injured so laboriously dragged their way back, 2 human streams, the sound and the unsound. Before us, all energies were devoted to destruction. Behind us, all human power and skill tried to repair the damage. And that intimacy between killing and injury, between military violence and medical innovation, is one of the well springs from which my own work derives. But I need to begin by capturing that experience of being wounded. I don't want it to remain abstract, disembodied, and certainly not something to be hidden in columns of endless figures. And so let me take you to this memorial by Private John Stafford, who describes what happened to him on the Somme on the 8th of August, 1916. Shortly after he was wounded, he collapsed. When he came to, he writes, "I made my first effort of movement to follow a wounded figure, only to discover that my right leg was so badly smashed that the slightest movement over the irregular ground caused indescribable pain. He was moving very slowly, and when about 15 yards had been made, he slithered into a hole. With my eyes fixed on that spot, I moved forward. Heaven knows how long it took me to reach there. A craving voice brought me to my senses, and I found I was lying on my back in a narrow trench, my badly injured leg screwed halfway up my back." He tried to examine his wounds. I could tilt up on my elbow, but only for a short time, as this action caused severe pain to my hip. A bullet had passed through the flesh of the upper left thigh and entered the extreme inner high point of the right leg. The thigh bone was considerably shattered, the bullet having travelled downwards towards the knee. My field dressing was used, and I lay flat again. His thirst increased. The sun was high in the sky. It was a sweltering hot day that summer on the Somme. The ground on which I lay was completely red, saturated with the blood of his wound. Then came darkness, and with the fall of darkness his hopes were raised, because it was then he expected the regimental stretcher bearers to inch their way out into no man's land and recover the wounded. But to no avail. A second day drew to its close. A feeling of drowsiness overcame me. My next sensation was that of cold water trickling down my neck into my chest. I heard friendly voices. "Where are you hit, chum?" The corporal remained with me and sent his pals for a stretcher, urging them to hurry as dawn was approaching. They struggled over uneven ground for about a mile, lowering the stretcher and laying flat whenever a very light shot into the air. The journey that he underwent was undertaken by countless thousands and thousands of others on both sides. And it was a journey of extraordinary difficulty, depending on the terrain and the weather. Here, for example, is J.H. Newton describing that classic landscape of the Western Front, the ground a sea of mud, and we have to carry the wounded 3 miles to the dressing stations. 2 men using stretcher slings couldn't carry a man 30 yards, and I've seen 4 bearers up to their knees in mud, unable to move without further assistance. The fortunate made it to an advanced dressing station, where they were patched up. The more seriously wounded were loaded onto ambulances, at first horse-driven and then motor ambulances, which rattled over the broken ground. But before they moved, somebody was there to take their particulars. The reason for taking these particulars, one RAMC subaltern made clear, and making out forms, is to prevent any man being lost sight of, whatever happens to him. But of course, mistakes were made. Much of the care at this stage was still being given by orderlies without sufficient training, let alone sufficient time to diagnose what had happened to the wounded body in front of them. As those ambulances set off, they very often had to halt to make way for ammunition coming up in the other direction. Ammunition first, way for ammunition. The ambulances could not get through, even when they were not stuck in the mud, and men were dying by the roadside. That is the army rule, explained George Carter. Ammunition before everything, wounded second. The ambulance took them to a casualty clearing station. There, for the first time, they encountered female nurses. And there, too, the first life-saving surgery, what was called now damage control surgery, was undertaken. So one wounded soldier recalls 4 doctors stripped to their trouser tops, working like butchers on mangled men. And one of those surgeons explained that a quick surgeon might get through from 15 to 20 cases in a spell of 12 hours. These were mass casualty episodes which overwhelmed the early military medical machine. Those that made it through from the advanced dressing station and the casualty clearing station were loaded on ambulance trains. And there too, there's that same mechanical, monotonous rhythm of stretchers being loaded one after the other, normally in the cold light of dawn or at the very end of the day, and that scene being repeated time and time again. As one volunteer from the Friends Ambulance Service recorded, watching this time after time, you feel as if a picture were being cast on a screen and flashed out over and over again. For there's something cruelly mechanical about it all. But even when they were on the ambulance train, not only were the trains unreliable, they too had to yield, to wait in sidings for the ammunition trains to trundle their way up to the front. And very often, when they got down to the coast to the base hospitals, they found that those hospitals were overwhelmed, that it took hours for the injured to be unloaded. Sometimes they would arrive at a siding to discover that the hospital was so full it could take at most 2 or 3 cases, and the rest had to travel on to destinations unknown. But eventually, if they survived the journey, they arrived at a base hospital on the coast of France. From there, after several days, if their wound was judged a blighty wound, they were moved across the channel on hospital ships. Once the ship docked, they were unloaded onto yet other hospital trains. The most seriously wounded didn't travel far from ports like Southampton, but the rest, including those still with serious injuries, moved up to London. Yet others were taken still further, In a sense, the further you travelled, the less serious your wound. During the first day of the Somme, those trains rolled in almost every hour to Charing Cross and Paddington stations. Now, what I've just described to you was the ideal, typical sequence. It wasn't a smoothly oiled, functioning machine. It broke down, it slowed, it collapsed in all sorts of ways. It posed the most extraordinary problems of logistics. But of course, even more important than the system collapsing was the failure of so many broken bodies to make it. And the journey itself was a paradox because it was supposed to be a journey to safety, to healing, to care. And yet the journey itself, even and precisely because there were so many attempts to speed it up, often exacerbated not only the pain, but the vulnerability of the patient. Here's another medical officer. People are so pleased with the excellence of the transport arrangements that they forget what a great additional strain any transport imposes on the patients. They're apt to lay approving stress on how quickly they've transported thousands of cases to England without regarding, or at least mentioning, how many men this express transport has cost their lives. And what was all this for? Well, it wasn't, as you might think, the fulfillment of some unwritten social contract. Men willing to lay down their lives for their country were entitled to be rescued and restored to health. The object of the exercise was a clinically mechanical one. It was a cost-benefit exercise. It was, as Anna Carden-Coyne points out in The Politics of War, a Taylorist approach to war, which was designed to intervene as rapidly as possible, as close to the fighting as possible, to send as many men back to the fighting as possible. And roughly 4 out of 5 of those injured on the Western Front were returned to the fight. Now, this was a war in which, of course, civilians were vulnerable. They got sick, but more to the point, they were wounded by shells, by gas attacks. But for the most part, civilian casualties were treated in place, often by the military. Few of them were evacuated. Rather, they were delivered directly and as soon as possible into the French medical system. Let me now fast forward 100 years to Afghanistan, in which you'll see all sorts of things have changed, but all sorts of things are also remarkably similar. Perhaps the most important is that mass casualty events are now defined not in thousands of bodies, but tens of bodies. What's more, the location of each of those bodies is known, and in most instances, those soldiers are accompanied by a skilled combat medical technician. And that's important because since the bloody days on the Somme, we've learnt that what matters most is what happens in the first 5 minutes after somebody's been wounded. The so-called platinum 10 minutes, when the combat medical technician delivers immediate life-saving care. And then what follows is super-fast evacuation. This is a radically different geometry, both of violence and of evacuation. Our battle space, says Brian Turner in My Life as a Foreign Country, will occur in a 360-degree, three-dimensional environment. Now, of course, Afghanistan was hardly the first war without fronts. You can see something of this already in the deserts of North Africa in the Second World War. But you can certainly see the idea of a front and a linear system of evacuation collapsing in Korea and Vietnam. But in Afghanistan, it's radicalized, and the whole process of evacuation is transformed by two essential innovations. The first is the radio. So it becomes possible not only for the combat medical technician to render vital first aid, and often very sophisticated first aid, in the first 10 minutes, but also for the platoon, the patrol, to immediately call for medical evacuation. They do that by issuing what's called a 9-liner, which spells out the severity of the injury and the speed required to get the casualty to hospital. And that then brings us to the second major innovation, which is, of course, the helicopter. A helicopter which is used in different ways by the US and the British Army, but which nonetheless attempts not only to ferry the casualty as fast as possible to definitive life-saving surgery, but also to have on board even more sophisticated medical personnel who are able to administer life-saving support throughout that flight. But again, that can't remain a purely abstract geometry. So let me describe what happened to Technical Sergeant Daniel Fye after he stepped on an anti-personnel mine in Afghanistan in May 2011. Fye's world erupted, and he found himself sitting in a hole. His ears rang. Dirt was everywhere. Small fires smouldered about him. He couldn't hear anything. Someone's been hit, Fye thought, but I'm on the ground. That means I got hit. Hey, Dove, dude, I think I got hit, Fye called out. If Dove answered, Fye couldn't hear. Fye looked down into the crater, saw his left leg tucked under his right, saw odd bumps and projections through the tan uniform. No more looking down. Now, I take this extraordinary recovery of what happened to Fye from Brian Kastner's brilliant book, All the Ways We Kill and Die. He continues, Dove, that's the combat medical technician, put the tourniquet on Fye's right leg because that was the only one that looked injured. Pete Hopkins, the medic, threw open his aid bag, slipped on a condom and fist-fucked Fye's left thigh with his gloved hands, his fingers probing deep inside the injured leg. He buried his fingers in the wounds and twisted them around until he found the femoral and stopped the worst of the hemorrhage. The two of them, working on the artery, on the tourniquet, pushed their hands into his leg and needles into his arms. They worked on him for a long time, says Kastner. But the more they worked, the more anxious they got about the minutes slipping away. I don't hear the bird, Fye said over and over again. Eventually, 25 minutes after the blast, they heard the helicopter. Fye thought it was the most wonderful sound he'd ever heard. They were at the extreme limit of the NATO footprint, so it was a 60-kilometre flight to the main hospital at Kandahar. If they moved quickly, Fye would just make it in the magic golden hour. With a heft, they slid his stretcher into the hello, and Fye's view changed from open blue sky to enclosed black metal and rivets. Fye spun in a morphine dream of swirling and vibrating wind. The rotor wash pummeled him with engine exhaust. He was bleeding out in the back of the helicopter. But he kept thinking, 1 hour. If I can get back to Kandahar in the hour, I'll live. 1 hour and I'll live. That's what they say. You'll make it if you can get back to the hospital in 1 hour. That's the so-called golden 60 minutes. But if you look at this map showing the coverage provided by Army helicopters in Afghanistan in 2007, that was the coverage possible, allowing 2 hours flight time between the point of injury and surgery. That in 2007. If we try to keep to the golden hour, coverage shrinks. So for many soldiers injured in the early years of the war, they were beyond reach of the golden hour. Many of them had to wait far, far longer. Now, the same applies to enemy combatants, to the Taliban, to insurgents. They too are medevaced in exactly the same way, using exactly the same procedures. And over time, all of those combatants being medevaced found the evacuation times getting shorter and shorter and shorter. The magic moment happens around about 2010, 2011, when most of those flights come in under the 60 minutes. They land at level 3 medical facilities like Camp Bastion, where damage control surgery is carried out. But from there, there's an elaborate system of teleconferencing. The doctors and nurses that treat those injured soldiers, men and women, hook up with their counterparts in Germany, in the United States, at Selly Oak in Birmingham. So there's an elaborate monitoring and a pre-warning of what's in store once those patients take the long journey by air. In the case of American servicemen and women, to Landstuhl in Germany, and from there to facilities like the Walter Reed National Medical Center in Maryland. And from there, many of them face 18 months, 2 years of rehabilitation. Now, all of that, in so very many ways, seems to be radically different from the First World War. But there's another, still more telling difference, which is to say that most of those injured during the fight in Afghanistan are not combatants at all. They're civilians. Most of them are far beyond the reach of any helicopter because, quite simply, nobody knows they've been injured. And they're left to make their way, painfully and precariously, usually by night, to whatever aid post or clinic they can find. But yet they too, in certain circumstances, are eligible for evacuation. The rules of the game say that when there's no suitable Afghan hospital close to hand, then Afghan civilians with life, limb, or eyesight-threatening medical emergencies can be evacuated to a military hospital, and provided they're not standing in the way of the treatment of military personnel, they can be treated. And it turns out that the treatment of Afghan civilians made up the majority, in some cases as much as 80% of the patients cared for during the lifetime of most of those level 3 hospitals in Afghanistan. But they were discharged as soon as possible, according to the rules, into the so-called Afghan system. Now you can imagine the sort of care that was available there compared with Landstuhl or Walter Reed or Selly Oak. But let me go back over their journey. The usual narrative is one which talks about civilian casualties arising from insurgent attacks. But as Jennifer Terry points out, what's missing from that narrative are those wounds caused by the myriad airdrop detonating devices, elevated to the status of why are those wounds not elevated to the status of signature wounds suffered by civilians? The answer, she says, is because the bodies suffering these wounds are those of the other. They're abject and disavowed wounds. So let me give you 2 examples of what happens. This is the story of a young girl, Aisha, whose immediate family were killed during a missile attack on a pickup truck in which they were travelling home from market. The missiles struck between 5:30 and 10 to 6 in the evening. One of the first people on the scene didn't believe anybody had survived until he saw the body of a little girl. Her face had been scrambled. She didn't have her nose. She still had both of her legs, but he wasn't sure if her torso was connecting them to the rest of her body. It wasn't until she asked in a frail voice, "Where is my father? Where is my mother?" that he understood her not only to be alive, but to be his 4-year-old niece, Aisha. His companion literally held her together for the drive back to the small market town, a 2-mile journey during which she made no sound. His companion then offered to drive her to seek medical help. He set out after 8 o'clock. Again, it's safer to travel at night. There's much less risk of an attack from the air. He was following the road to Asadabad. They didn't arrive at the hospital there until after 10 o'clock, a full 7 hours after the attack. But when they arrived at the hospital, there was very little that local Afghan hospital could do. And so they sent her on, again by road, to the nearest hospital in Jalalabad, 57 miles away. At midnight, she was admitted to Jalalabad Hospital. But again, apart from minor treatment, there was remarkably little that hospital could do for her. And so, on the 3rd day, she was flown by helicopter to Kabul. The first helicopter had trouble landing and left without her. Another came around midnight, and eventually she was taken to a Roll 3 hospital at Kabul airport. Now, under the rules of the game, casualties are supposed to reach a Roll 3 hospital within 1 to 2 hours of the injury. Her journey had taken 30 hours to reach that Roll 3 hospital. So for wounded civilians in Afghanistan, there are no platinum 5 or 10 minutes. In the case of a drone strike, first responders are held back for fear of a second double-tap strike. And there's often not even a golden hour. The hour stretches into hours, stretches into days. Some are luckier. Here's a second example, a story of a young boy, Suhrab, following a drone strike in Uruzgan province on the 21st of February 2010, or more accurately, a strike carried out by 2 combat helicopters under direction from a drone crew. Several hours after the strike, when it became clear that the victims were likely not insurgents but civilians, US Special Forces arrived on the ground. And within 30 minutes, sent an urgent 9-liner for a medical evacuation. 2 helicopters landed and took the survivors to 2 military hospitals, 1 American and 1 Dutch, at Tarin Kowt. And on the way, these bodies have already been transferred into the typical biomedical gaze of the evacuation chain. There, they were treated. And we know all this because there was a subsequent inquiry into the strike. And the officer leading that inquiry, Major McHale, visited the survivors in the Dutch military hospital. "This is the kid that lost the leg," said the doctor. "Under the circumstances, he's doing all right. This is the kid." His name is Surab, as I've said. His father, his brother, and his sister were all killed in the strike. The doctor explains that the biggest challenge he's going to face will be managing the increasingly sequential size of the prosthesis as he grows, so that artificial leg must grow with him. He'll need a lot of backup, says the doctor. But in fact, as soon as possible, all of those survivors were transferred out of the military system into the local hospital at Tarin Kowt. And his family declined further aid and elected to make their own arrangements for a prosthesis to be fitted at the Red Cross Orthopaedic Centre in Kabul, days away. Surab went there with several of the other survivors. Here's one of them. "Where I live is far from here, a 3-day journey. There are no hospitals that could make leg prostheses locally. No Red Cross stations came to this centre to receive a new prosthesis. It will make my life much easier. So what you can see here is something about the scale. These are mass casualty incidents, all right. These are the files of male amputations recorded at the Red Cross Centre in Kabul. Not just those, but a wall of them. And you can see too that this chain is racialized and ethnicized. There is a prosthetics of military violence, and all you have to do is compare the 2 years of rehabilitation on offer for British and American soldiers. Compare the limbs that are fitted to them. And I don't mean to minimize their pain and their suffering, but compare their lot with those Afghan civilians. So far, I've described an evacuation chain conducted by the military. And I've compared Belgium and France 100 years ago with Afghanistan now. But for my third visit, I want to take us to a radically different geography, that of Syria. The severity of the wounds encountered by the people of Syria over time has changed and intensified spectacularly. So much so that trauma surgeons in Syria and visiting from abroad insisted that they had never encountered injuries like it. Now, Omar Dawachi has explored what happens to many of those suffering those wounds. He writes about therapeutic geographies, about the reorganization of healthcare and the way in which so many of those injured have sought medical care outside of Syria for reasons which will become obvious in a moment if they're not already blindingly obvious already. But the work that Omar has done focuses for the most part on those who've raised the funds for their treatment in private hospitals or who've been subsidized by their governments to make the journey, in particular from Iraq to Lebanon, to Turkey, to Jordan. But I want to insist that those therapeutic geographies are also traumatic geographies. They're traumatic partly because of the immediate and continuing trauma of the wound. They're traumatic because of the trauma of the journey. And they're also traumatic in all those cases where it's not possible to move at all. In the first part of this lecture, I described evacuation chains speeding up, speeding up, speeding up. What I've just been talking about are evacuation chains for civilians, which slow down and down and down. Not a liquid modernity, but a gelatinous modernity. Now, we'll see something of that right now, but we'll also see eventually what happens when those evacuation chains grind to a halt. Now, at the beginning of the war in Syria, it was increasingly difficult to move injured patients around because they would be arrested and detained and very often tortured by the security services. So all sorts of stations were improvised to care for the injured outside the regular hospital system. One man volunteered his bedroom in this example here. And, in this case, a skilled, trained doctor unpacked one of the medical kits he and his colleagues had hidden in every town in the area. In a sense, they had, he said, stuffed an operating room into a suitcase. An anesthesiologist recommended dosages by cell phone. We put him on the bed in the bedroom and we opened up his stomach. As the war ground on, more improvisations were necessary. A system of moving the injured through those rebel-held areas, particularly the areas under siege, came into being. In some cases, ambulances. In other cases, as you can see here in Homs, trucks, taking the wounded to wherever they might be treated, most often to improvised field hospitals. Now, faced with a medical system in a state of near-terminal collapse in those rebel-held areas, it's not surprising that the next thought was to try to evacuate those patients across one of Syria's borders. Here is Jonathan Little talking about the situation in Homs as early as 2012. The doctor in the improvised field hospital there explains that the border is very hard to cross into Lebanon. Sometimes you have to wait an hour or two, sometimes it's closed. Some patients die on the border, others are brought back to the medical tent and die there. What's more, it takes 4 hours from the tent to Tripoli, which is often too long. And so it's possible to plot what Jenna Lloyd and others have called a geopolitics of trauma, which relates not to refugees in this case, at least not directly, but to the wounded, the injured, and the sick. So let me give you a rapid-fire sketch map geography of trauma across the borders. First of all, Lebanon. In much the same way that inside Syria, doctors and nurses referred to one another by code names. They gave their hospitals, the secret subterranean hospitals, code names. The same precautions had to be put in place to remove patients across the border. This from Reuters on the 14th of December 2011. The elderly Lebanese doctor gets a text message, "Your bag of eggplants is ready." He jumps in his jeep, races into the foothills on the Syrian border, searching for the wounded protester he knows is waiting for his help. This time the doctor finds Ahmed shot in the leg. It took Ahmed all night to make the 7-kilometre journey from his nearby Syrian village. And over time, of course, those escape routes were blocked. Syrian troops laid anti-personnel mines along the border with Lebanon. And then, from 2012, the Air Force started bombing bridges and mountain roads used by those trying to flee into Lebanon. From time to time, the International Committee of the Red Cross managed to negotiate evacuation. Ambulances met the injured at the border and then transferred them to clinics, almost always, in the first instance, in the Bekaa Valley. Now, these clinics were makeshift affairs, but many of them were also clandestine, because if you know your geography, you will know that the Bekaa Valley is a Hezbollah stronghold, and Hezbollah was busy fighting on the other side of the border in support of the Assad regime. And many of those fleeing across the border, although flight is hardly the right metaphor for the agonizingly slow and painful journey that they undertook, many of them were Sunni. And many of them were frightened, not only by what had happened to them, many of them were uncertain, had no idea where they were, but once they knew where they were, they became alarmed. In fact, many of those clinics were raided by Hezbollah in search of rebels, insurgents who had risen up against the Assad regime. Doctor, we have to leave because there's a raid going on. One neurosurgeon was warned. He rushed to help 4 patients into his car and raced from the clinic. His next move, of course, was to establish another clinic, and then another clinic. Then, when those patients are well enough to travel, to be moved outside the Bekaa Valley to hospitals in Tripoli, very often those ambulances are stopped and attacked. It's a familiar story, according to one doctor who runs a field clinic in Arsal in the Bekaa Valley. Several of his patients are being beaten at Hezbollah checkpoints in the Bekaa Valley. They want to see the injuries. If they can see visible injury, they'll let the casualty through. But if it's a hidden internal injury, very often, as you can see, he reports those patients are beaten. Where's the injury? I want to see the injury. But as soon as possible, as I've said, most of those casualties are moved out of the Bekaa Valley to Tripoli. Now that's a problem because so much of the healthcare in Lebanon is privatised and expensive. There are reports of some hospitals ejecting those casualties after a few days, confiscating their x-rays, removing their splints. So yet more makeshift clinics were installed until in September 2014, the International Committee of the Red Cross established what it called the Weapon Traumatology Training Centre at 2 hospitals in Tripoli, Lebanon. The cases we see here, said one doctor working there, we don't see anywhere else. They're war wounds and they're infected and they have a lot of complications and they've been previously operated on many times. So that journey that I've been describing in the early years of the uprising, in the early years of the war, a few kilometres, a few hours, maybe a couple of days. As the war grinds on, that journey for some patients can stretch into weeks and even months as patients are moved from clinic to field hospital inside Syria and then across the border into Lebanon. Here's one of those surgeons at the Traumatology Training Centre describing the condition of a patient that finally reaches him. The joint had been shattered into 1,000 pieces. At least it looked like 1,000 on the half-torn and faded x-ray that he offered me in explanation. He had been looked at in a field hospital in Syria, a hospital where 2 young Syrian doctors, neither much older than their patient, and neither a fully trained surgeon, had done their best to patch up Abdul's gut. He had been their 40th patient that day. And it took him and his grief-stricken mother, the rest of the family had been killed, more than half a year to reach us at the Weapons Traumatology Training Centre in Lebanon. And many of those surgeries, as I've indicated, that were carried out by semi-trained, often untrained workers inside Syria, produce their own complications. These are emergency amputations, one of the specialists points out, so it's not an orthopaedic surgeon, it's a general surgeon or a dentist who is carrying them out. Under those conditions, many doctors cut the bone straight across, not at an angle, as they should to create a better stump. And if the stump is flat instead of cylindrical, patients need a second or a third surgery. We're dealing with patients, another doctor says, who've already gone through several surgeries and many of them were not conducted properly. He describes another patient whose rod was encased in cement. It really looked as if it was done in the back of a garage. We had to amputate the whole leg as a result. Let's look at another border, Turkey. Here, hospitals have been built across the border, specifically to treat injured Syrian patients, like the Amal Hospital here in Reyhani. Urgent cases are granted entry across the border into Turkey. There are a series of designated transfer points along the border, and ambulances ferry the injured into hospitals. Every month, dozens of Syrian amputees, writes one reporter, both fighters and civilians alike, can be fitted with upper and lower limbs in this clinic in Reyhanli. The limbs are manufactured locally in Turkey, and although they cost hundreds of dollars, the clinic provides them free of charge to the amputees. But again, compare those prostheses with those available in the United States or in Britain or in France. The journeys are precarious. Again, the Red Cross has intervened on a number of occasions to open brief windows for convoys to take out the injured across the border into Turkey. But the fact is that border has been steadily tightened and militarised. In fact, in June 2016, Turkey completed the construction of a wall across the border with Syria. It also increased its involvement in the war and intensified its campaign against Kurdish rebels. And so now it's increasingly difficult, even for injured patients, to gain access into Turkey. And that puts them at the mercy of people smugglers and traffickers, and of course makes their journey even more hazardous. There are no ambulances crisscrossing the border, or at least very few. What about Jordan? Well, here too, the border is militarised and now closed. But an exception is made for the war wounded. They're screened by the Jordanian Border Guard Force and the Royal Medical Service to determine whether they require emergency life-saving treatment or not. And they must have ID to gain access. And Amnesty International has traced a whole series of heartbreaking incidents in which people with life-threatening injuries were refused entry, either because they didn't pass the medical bar or because they couldn't find their ID in their rush to leave their bombed village or their basement. But those that do cross the border are taken to a series of hospitals like this one at Ramtha, supported by MSF since 2013. And then in 2006, MSF established a reconstructive surgery program in Amman, there, to provide long-term care. Here's the example of Mohammed Smarat, who had been helping farmers pick tomatoes near his home in Daraa, near the southern border with Jordan, when a stray bullet shattered his left hip. He made the journey from Ramtha for immediate surgery and then on to Amman, because there were no field hospitals in Daraa capable of treating him. He spent 6 weeks there before being returned to Syria. So you might think that in Jordan, for those that do make it across the border, they're safe. Well, here's the face of one of those young men, with his left arm cut off above the elbow, one of his legs encased in a metal splint. He looks, says one reporter, like thousands of others whose lives have been shredded by the violence of the Syrian civil war. But it turns out that he's the face of a new threat, because the doctors in Amman have found that his wound is so deeply infected that it's resistant to multiple drugs. And a growing number of Syrians moving across the border, not just into Jordan but elsewhere, are found to be resistant to drugs. And in consequence, the only way their lives can be saved is for radical surgery, amputation. Now, that whole issue of antimicrobial resistance predates the war, but it's clearly been made far worse by the war itself, by the nature of the weapons deployed, which drive contaminants deep into the body, by a shortage of specialist trauma surgeons who are skilled in the arts of infection and sterilisation control, and the insanitary condition of those field hospitals. So, as that young man puts it himself, even when we're safe in Jordan, we're not safe. And lastly, Israel. Many of those denied entry to Jordan turn to Israel. They turn to another militarised border on the Golan Heights. And of course, the Israeli military treats this as a humanitarian operation, ready each night to receive the wounded as they arrive, very often on foot or on the back of a donkey or a mule. There's no ambulance on the other side, one officer explains. Sometimes they arrive in the back of a truck or car, but on Mount Hermon they come with donkeys. When they arrive in the middle of the winter, they're sometimes in an extremely serious condition. They receive emergency medical treatment from the IDF, and then they're transferred under the terms of Operation Good Neighbour to one of 2 Israeli medical centres. And here there's a new problem. That's to say, to find out what's happened to those patients, the nature of their wounds. Again, some of them have been weeks in making that journey, trying multiple times to gain access to Jordan, being refused, and eventually making it to Israel. They come with blood-stained notes pinned to their blankets, but most, says this reporter, have entailed pure guesswork. And yet the surgery that's on offer there, the prostheses that are provided, as the Israeli military is very quick to show in this image, are radically different from the much more rudimentary procedures carried out very early on in Jordan and still carried on in Turkey. But here too, these medical interventions are not disinterested in much the same way that Turkey has an interest in intervening in the war and beating back the rise of independent Kurdistan. So Israel has a strategy to secure its hold over the Golan Heights, to hobble the advance of Iran and Hezbollah towards the border. And of course, these interventions provoke anxieties of a different kind in many of the patients about what happens when they return from treatment in Israel. But finally, let me say that for the vast majority of Syrians critically injured in this war, movement is out of the question. The Syrian state passed a law which criminalised all medical aid to the opposition. Then, under the terms of that, made it quite clear that all of those providing medical aid to the opposition are legitimate targets. So hospitals were bombed repeatedly. Specialist trauma surgeons, orthopaedic surgeons, obstetric surgeons killed. And of course, when you bomb the hospital, you bomb the people and you bomb all its equipment. We're relying on domestic medicine cabinets to treat the injured in this field hospital. We don't have any blood for donations or oxygen. It becomes impossible in many of those besieged areas throughout the closing years of the war, as I think we now have to call them, for ambulances to ferry patients because very often they've been attacked. Patients are brought from one hospital in order to be transferred to another, but it was impossible to move them because of the intensity of the bombing. In an attempt to minimise the effects of bombing, hospitals dispersed their facilities so that if a bomb took out the ICU, the blood bank was intact. But as the bombing intensified in areas like Douma, of course, it became impossible to move patients from one dispersed unit to another. The central blood bank is just 7 kilometres away, says one doctor, but with the intense bombing and shelling, it might as well be 70. They cannot get there. So it's difficult to move patients around. We're back to that paradox of immobility that I started out with in Syria. But also, it's increasingly difficult to find supplies. The supply chains are precarious. They too are under threat from bombs, from shells, and from sniper fire. So much so that in many of those besieged areas, innovation was necessary. People started to make their own gauze. Because gauze was synonymous with war surgery, it wasn't allowed across the siege lines. It's precious, dangerous, incriminating, one doctor says. There are secret outlets manufacturing gauze. When aid convoys were allowed across the siege lines, all medical supplies virtually were removed from them, including basic medicine, surgical kits, anaesthesia, aid for chronic and acute illnesses. So new improvisations became necessary. One doctor describes making his own anaesthetic, which he says works almost as well as the real thing. It gives a completely new meaning to the idea of a local anaesthetic. Those surgeons that remain have had to learn new skills far beyond their original specialties, to operate outside their comfort zone. And they're often supported by a version of telemedicine, by networks of surgeons in Britain, in Canada, the United States and elsewhere, who advise what are very often unskilled medical students, dentists, vets, in how to carry out major surgery. And I'm sure many of you know the extraordinary work of David Knott. But these improvisations become ever more desperate. Here was one hospital which treated a young boy whose limbs had been severed by moulding bandages from moist printer paper to create a paper mache-like gauze over his bleeding stumps while splinting his broken forearm with a tree branch. Then, as time runs out, so many of those clinics close. It's no longer possible to provide any medical care. This applies not just to those suffering injuries, but from those suffering from cancer, those needing kidney dialysis. Here in Eastern Ghouta, each patient used to have 2 to 3 dialysis sessions per week. Then it became 1 a week. With the delay in receiving the necessary supplies, we're forced to decrease it to 1 session every 10 days. And all requests for medical evacuation, for taking these critically ill patients across the siege lines to receive treatment, were refused. And so, as the siege goes on, people start to re-sterilise surgical equipment, from gloves to tubes and even the surgical blades and sutures, even if it's for a single stitch and just 1 centimetre long. We're working with stitches that were used before, disposable gloves that we wore before, chest drainage that was used on other patients. Is it any surprising that wounds get infected and that so many patients are resistant to even the strongest drugs? We're using bandages that we used before. And ultimately, at the end of the day, the only surgery that's possible is a choice between life or death. Little or no room left to rescue limbs, preserve sight, ward against fatal infections. All of those things that are part of the NATO military code of medical practice in Afghanistan. All of those become impossible in Syria. And so let me bring this grim narrative to its close. I want to end with the comments of Joanna Bourke on the right about Elaine Scurry's book, with which I began. She says, Elaine Scurry has eloquently pointed out that rhetoric about the pain of wounds has been largely metaphorical, emptied of human content. Landscapes are wounded and cry out in pain, but the voices of individual men and women have been drowned out. And I think it's possible to work with the ideas that, for example, Jennifer Terry and others have drawn on from Gregory Whitehead to capture what they call a woundscape, to actually make those wounds speak. So, if you think back over everything I've been talking about, it becomes clear through all those examples that the act of being wounded immediately increases a person's vulnerability. It may be difficult for them to see, breathe, or call for help. It may be impossible for them to move unaided, and a penetrating wound makes them vulnerable to catastrophic blood loss or life-threatening infection. It should become clear too that being wounded transforms the casualty's corpography. That's to say, it changes the ways in which they're aware of their own body and the landscape that surrounds them. If they're conscious, their horizon simultaneously contracts into the place in which they sense the extent of their injury, a crater, a ditch, a room, and expands at the same time into the fractured space in which they seek to register threat and anticipate medical assistance. It'll become clear too, I think, that woundscapes are often racialised and gendered, marked by notations of privilege and distinction. As you can see from this slide, it wasn't all white on the Western Front. And some of those markings are tied to the wound itself, but many derive from the coding, that's to say, the reading of the body of the casualty. Is this an American or a British body, or is this an Afghan body? Is this an insurgent or a civilian? Are you with us or are you against us? It'll be clear too that travelling through a woundscape transforms a casualty's vulnerability. Movement may attract further military violence. The journey may be so long that it increases the likelihood of death. There may be no skilled medical care or resources within reach, and any clinic or hospital may itself become a target. Travelling through a woundscape also transforms the way in which they register the progress of their injury through smell, sound, and pain, and the arc of their movement through their body's response to changes of speed and direction, or to jolts, sounds, and vibrations. And lastly, it will be clear that places in that woundscape become way stations on a journey whose shape and terminus are at best unclear and uncertain for almost all of the injured and wounded. They become sites of what I call estranged safety, at once precious and precarious, in which the casualty may register the signs of care, the prick of the needle, the smell of anaesthetic, the feel of clean white sheets, but also the signs that all is not well, the reopening of the wound, pain, damage control surgery, the sight and sound of other patients, and in many cases, the continuing sounds and sensation of military violence, safe and yet radically unsafe. But I want now, finally, in 1 minute, to unsettle everything I've just said. And I do so by turning to the work of a remarkable man, Joseph Pugliese, who wants us to understand suffering and trauma not simply as centred on the human being and the human subject. We need, he says, to think of what I've been talking about as a trauma geography as a multidimensional matrix in which suffering is traced in terms of its wave-like motion through bodies, but also through communities and across their ecologies. What Joseph is talking about is the trauma war inflicts on all life forms. We're used to the shattered stumps of Passchendaele, one of the classic images of the First World War. That's where I started, but I ended with Syria, and that's where I'll end now. Qasim Aid, in his remarkable memoir, My Country, talks about stumbling through his bombed village, Muadamiyah, on the outskirts of Damascus. I'd never felt so lonely, he said. I was desperate for a hug, but all the people I wanted to hug were beyond my reach. I wept. Then after looking around to make sure I was really alone, I hugged the olive tree. There's no one left to hug, I told it. He later writes in his diary, even the trees are their enemies. The olive orchards and lemon trees of his village are more than just a livelihood. They're friends and allies. They're the living legacy of my townsfolk. We love each tree. They put their arms around us. So, of course, he says, the Assad regime has been deliberately targeting our beautiful olive trees. They're killing our friends, the trees we love. Whole groves of trees are shelled in Syria, and no one hears the sound they make. I would have to add, no one hears the sound of they make either. No one hears the branches crack and break but us. And so he ends, hear the trees. If you will not hear the human screams in Syria, at least hear the ancient screams of the trees. Thank you.
What I was moved to think about from your very first case study was the archive you were drawing on, particularly the artistic archive. Because it seemed to me that, I mean, one of the things you're doing in the talk is obviously tracing this, mapping these trauma geographies, putting them together. But it seemed to me that from the artistic archive, there's an effort to document these trauma geographies as well. So it made me think about what the public discourse is around these trauma geographies in each of the case studies that you're looking at, and what that tells us perhaps about the spatialities that you're trying to trace, and maybe also the role that this term wounded landscapes can play.
Well, could take another hour, thank you. I really will try to be brief. I'm sorry for having gone on so long. I've deliberately tried to work with a range of different sources and to admit a range of different voices. I don't want to downplay the biomedical discourse that's involved in treating and evacuating casualties, because that's a discourse which has all sorts of real performative consequences. It is, of course, through that discourse that the evacuation itself is made possible. It's also the discourse which undergoes a series of transformations to perform a very important rhetorical function within the public sphere. So that in the First World War, for example, it became vitally important to emphasize how efficient, how skilled that system of medical evacuation was. And there was no mention of any of the stalls, the disruptions, the dislocations, the breakdowns that I've described. Every once in a while, in the case of Afghanistan, and before the era of fake news, there were eruptions in the public sphere about evacuation in Afghanistan taking too long, which is why eventually that golden hour was achieved. It was achieved at the urging of the then Secretary of Defense. So those biomedical discourses are immensely important, and I don't want to set them on one side. But precisely because even as I focus on physical injury and on the attempts during the First World War and beyond to deal with what was in the First World War called wound shock, as opposed to PTSD and what at the time was thought of as shell shock, I do want to register, as it were, the multiple vocabularies, the multiple registers in which patients and those that cared for them also came to terms with what was happening. Now, when I look at those registers, of course, I start to move beyond the body. What the biomedical discourse does is take me inside the body and start to think about the ways in which the very idea of the wounded body is increasingly reconceptualized and redefined right through the genealogy that I've been describing. I didn't describe all those different stages, but there are all sorts of differences about whether you open the body up or close it, whether you see the body as an assemblage of parts or rather as an integrated system, how you understand infection control, damage control surgery, pain, all of those things start to change. But what I should say is that I started down this road partly in response to having spent 10 years analyzing aerial violence and becoming sickened at my capacity to talk about the multiple ways in which people kill one another. And I wanted to flip the other side, which of course also does a lot of ideological work. You rescue the notion of late modern war by saying that we can actually rescue so many of the injured. The numbers dying in war now have gone down, as the wretched Steven Pinker points out, but what he fails to acknowledge is that the numbers of wounded have soared spectacularly. So I want to capture all of that. But the other reason was what I was talking about in that, in much the same way I don't seem to be able to give short lectures, that remarkably long essay of mine in Antipode on the natures of war, which was about the way in which bodies in war encountered the mud of the Western Front, the deserts of North Africa, the rainforests of Vietnam, and the effects that that has on the body. So what I tried to do in those last comments at the end was start to open back out into that direction and to think of these woundscapes not simply as something which is, of course, once intensely individual and profoundly social, and which is mediated in all kinds of ways by the connections between bodies and technologies, but I want to reach out into and think about the way in which the landscapes through which those bodies are being moved have a very profound effect on the wounded body itself. And of course, the passage of the wounded body has an effect on those landscapes too.
Hello, I'm Steve Legg from Nottingham. Thank you for that brilliant paper, Derek. Brilliantly difficult to watch and to listen to and obviously to put together. So I suppose I'd just like to ask you about some of the ethical decisions that you made in putting together this presentation and perhaps some of the tensions between those ethical decisions. One of the decisions was clearly that depictions of war tend to cauterize wounds, tend to anesthetize as to the actual bloody, messy reality of war, and that one representational ethical move is to force us to look at those bodies and at those wounds so that we continually have to contemplate what war is and what war does. But in doing that, you necessarily choose to represent victims who become victims because they're vulnerable, and once they become victims, they enter a new realm of vulnerability, which is to the vulnerability of infection, of wounding, but also to of representation, and possibly of misrepresentation. There are dozens of images of bodies and of victims here, none of whom can clearly consent or engage in their representations, and that goes from photographs to paintings to sketches. But you've clearly made that decision to square those two ethical imperatives. So I was just wondering if you could tell us about the ethical conversations you have with yourself when you think about how to represent this sort of material.
Yeah, you're quite right, and it's a common dilemma. Now, in the interviews that I've carried out, what I've done is obtain the consent, obviously, of those that I've spoken with. I've also drawn upon a whole series of dramatic renditions. So, for example, when I cite Brian Kastner and his remarkable recovery of what happens to Daniel Fye in his journey, the two of them are very close friends, and the book was produced in collaboration one with another. And what I found persistently in the people that I've spoken with, I'm not talking about veterans from the First World War, but again, in much of the work that I've done, I've drawn upon interviews which are carried out by the Imperial War Museum. These are audio interviews with survivors. But in many of the other instances that I've worked with, these are people who insist that their stories want to be told. Now, and they want to be shown in very particular ways. So, for example, one of the things that I found in talking with people who've had a prosthesis fitted following the loss of an arm or a leg, many of them, in fact all of those that I've spoken to, have no interest in concealing what's happened to them. They're not interested in having limbs which look like the real thing, so to speak. And perhaps that's the result of a 2-year rehabilitation program, but they've become attuned to the fact that their survival depends precisely upon this high-tech biomedical apparatus, which doesn't look like a hand, but it performs all the functions that their old hand could. It doesn't look like a leg, but it performs all the functions that their real leg used to be able to perform. And one of the difficulties they've talked about with me is precisely that if you try to conceal what's happened to you, if you end up with a prosthesis which looks like an arm, which looks like a leg, the price you pay for that is actually it doesn't work like an arm and it doesn't work like a leg. So there's always this tension, even in that narrative, between representation and function. So what I've tried to do in most of my work is to work with material which is in the public domain, which has been placed in the public domain in, as far as I can see, very considered ways, where consent has been given, or when I've conducted interviews myself. And of course, there are limitations in obtaining informed consent from people who've gone through these kinds of experiences. But I do want to say one thing, which is that I've tried very hard not to treat the people that I describe in the First World War, in Afghanistan, or in Syria as simply and uniquely passive. They are victims precisely in the sense that, in most instances, this is the very last thing they wanted, and they're surprised, astonished, shocked, taken aback, dismayed, all of the emotions you can imagine at finding out what has happened to them. So they're victims in that sense. They didn't wish this upon themselves. But I want to insist that every single one of the cases that I've looked at exhibits the most extraordinary tenacity. From that young man wounded in no man's land who is nonetheless able to drag himself across the mud and slither into the trench, who has the presence of mind to clap on the field dressing to stop the blood. To all of those people inside the siege lines in Syria who, in the most hideous circumstances, are improvising anaesthetics and gauze and surgical tools and treatment. So they're victims in one sense, but that doesn't, for me anyway, mean passivity.
I suppose my question follows on from the last, but more specifically, how satisfied or comfortable are you with the focus on the body alone in discussions of traumatic geographies or geographies of trauma, insofar as treating the body as a terrain or as a sort of field, as opposed distinct from the mind, the social, cultural effects?
I focus on the body, but that's not the only focus. But the reason that the body looms so large in what I say grows directly out of my work on aerial violence, which is to say that if you look at the narrative which endorses aerial violence in the 21st century, which treats it as capable of conducting a series of surgical strikes, in which weapons are now so precise and so accurate that everything can be conducted on a screen, it's a narrative which invites that image of bodiless war, of war as a series of visual abstractions. And there have been a series of books published within the last 3 months which continue to worry away at the military gaze, about the eye, about the optics of war, about the visual. And yet in so doing, even as they do that, the bodies start to slither away from view. So one of the reasons that I emphasize the body is precisely to dislocate that narrative. But having said that, it should be clear from what I've said, I hope, that I don't simply focus on the body as a biophysical structure, that I'm very much concerned with the experience of pain, with the way in which that's registered. And so if you go right the way back to the First World War, there was a very intricate debate developed around the distinction between what I called, I think earlier, wound shock and shell shock. And as you trace that narrative through, not just through a biomedical discourse again, or even through a psychological discourse, but through a whole series of other much more artistic renditions, it becomes impossible to think of the body simply as a physical corpus. So yes, I mean, I spend more of my time than I would wish reading trauma studies and thinking about how, not simply to give voice to, but how to emphasize the ways in which, when we deal with the physically injured, I mean, I keep coming back to that because there's so much work now on PTSD, and I think that's immensely important, but that's not really what I'm focusing on. I'm focusing on the sheer immediacy of the physical wound, the breach of the body, or for that matter, the chronic illness. What I want to do is register the multiple ways in which that experience of pain, of dread, of hope, all of those things come through, not simply as a battery of physical symptoms to which physical remedies can be applied, but in ways which, as I said earlier, reach into a much larger affective landscape.
Thanks. Full of admiration for you to be able to do this. I don't think I could do it, so it's really important that it is being done. I'm wondering, from all your work, if you have any insights into what are the possibilities, the potentials for working to reduce people's willingness to do this to each other.
A really great talk, and resonate a lot with a lot of the current work that's going on. I personally work on what's essentially wounded built heritage, so there's a lot of overlapping questions. And what I was wondering, the victims that you interview, what is the expectation that they have that comes out of that that experience of being interviewed by you, having their experiences documented, is it a therapeutic sort of journey in its own right, or do they have expectations that it will lead to something else?
Thank you. Thank you for both those questions too. And they are sort of connected. Let me try and deal with the first. When I think about the way in which geography has had such a long and intimate relationship with war, I keep being drawn back to Yves Lacoste, La géographie ça sert d'abord à faire la guerre. That geography's primary purpose has been to wage war. And I think of all of those instrumental ways in which geographical knowledges have been vital in the planning and the execution of military violence. Take, for example, targeting, which is, I'm afraid, a quintessentially geographical practice, although it can be narrowed to a peculiarly geometric and spatial practice. And in my lexicon, at any rate, those two are very different things. And in some cases, I understand that. You think of all of those geographers that were involved in the Second World War, for example. The length and breadth of this country, producing military intelligence, the naval handbooks. So there are a whole series of political and ethical choices to be made there. But I do think that in the last 10 years or so, there's been, you can trace this back to Vietnam and earlier, I'm sure, but in the last 10 years or so, there's been a much more insistently critical debate about the nature of military violence. But I think two dimensions are very often missing from at least some of that work. One is that I think we need to conduct much more sustained, detailed, slow, substantive research. That we should not immediately reach to theory to fill in the gaps in our own understanding. And my worry is that in too many studies of war, there's a problem which I see in other spheres too, which is to say the unstated conviction that the world exists in order to provide examples of our theories of it. So if we are to disable war, then of course, trust me, I like a theoretical workout as much as anyone. And I think, I'm not so dumb as to think that my work is not shot through with all kinds of incompatible ideas and theories of different levels of formalization. But I do think that if we are to speak to a larger public, then the theories that we use are best carried in solution. That's to say that the narratives that we have to tell, the way in which we confront a public to say, look, this is what war is like, this is what it does, and we need ideas to make those presentations compelling, to reach people politically, intellectually, but also emotionally. But we have to do so in a much more direct vocabulary. And we need to reach beyond our, if I dare say this, our academic journals, and find every possible way of engaging with a larger public, which otherwise shrugs its shoulders. The second thing I think we need to do, and I'll do this very quickly, is to think much more carefully about the legal armature, which I haven't talked about here at all, and about the ways in which we see a sustained assault on international humanitarian law, and about ways in which that needs to be strengthened. That's a political campaign. And the way in which international humanitarian law, which in principle admits of universal jurisdiction, as we know, is applied highly selectively against particular regimes, particular armies, particular individuals, and never against others. So I often think, that if I'd known about international law when I was an undergraduate at Cambridge, that's where I would have gone. I wouldn't be standing here. So the legal dimension, I don't mean it's a panacea. I certainly don't think it's a deus ex machina. That's why I think we need to actually join with legal scholars and have something very powerful to say about international law and its reach, that it shouldn't be there simply to license and to tolerate violence, but it should act as a much more powerful barrier, not simply a check, but a barrier to it. And people should know that their actions have consequences, that their violations have consequences. And then lastly, in relation to the people that I talk to, of course they have all kinds of different expectations. Some of them just want someone to listen. And you might find this hard to believe, but I've become quite good at listening over the last 10 years. But many of them have two other purposes, I think. One of them is precisely because they want that wider story to reach the widest possible public. And they don't want the story to be particularly about them. They don't see themselves as victims. They're not looking for pity, but they want something which is a much more structural sense of what war does to people and families and communities in the United States, in Britain, in Canada, but also in Afghanistan, in Syria, and elsewhere. And that's important. But I think too that what many of them struggle with, and I struggle with it too, is to square that circle between what I described as the intensely intimate nature of being wounded and the extraordinarily invasive intimacy that those young men and women have gone through as they've moved through the procedures that I've described, with at the same time the social nature of wounding. And by that I mean both the fact that they find themselves in a world, in a place where they can be wounded, and yet where they can also rely on other people. That there's a kind of sociality of care through which they are rescued and helped to heal. And talking is a very important way of navigating that complicated relationship between the two.
Derek, thank you so much. We are now officially at the time. Thank you. Thank you.